So this is section 5, which is the part of interest, and I tried to accommodate the pieces of information that Tobias was talking about. He and I talked yesterday and came up with something about this. The first question, of course, was the sub. When I did my work on it, I just took the sub and put the identity in it. The sub, as everybody probably knows, in section 7 is actually the key ID. That, we couldn't make it work with that, but if we do, we'll have to find some other way to handle recovery. And so the next thing that we talked about was how would we deal with recovery? And part of that would be to create some other ID somewhere else. But these are the kinds of recovery that I promised John that I'd list out from the last meeting we had. The device holding the authentication key can be lost. The key strength can be declared obsolete, and so you have to go to a new algorithm or something. The key becomes compromised, and you have to, or it's otherwise unusable. A truck runs over your phone or something like that. And the other thing is just that the user wants to have the functionality on more than one device. So they want to have two kinds of authenticators. I'm not sure that this spec would talk about the recovery methods. We could either put them in guidance on that at the bottom of the spec, or we could just leave it out altogether. But the kinds of things you could do is, for example, putting the key in a PFX with an encrypted user secret on it, which is the easiest way. The other way is to put it on a remote data store, which is the way that I implemented. And then the recovery comes down when you log into that remote data store. That requires you to have a trusted site that you can go to. You could have the key shared between multiple devices. The nice thing about that is they can kind of back each other up. If you did it that way. But in any way, you could always just generate a new ID altogether. If you have some other identifier that you can bind it to, you can later on do that binding and have that binding be just like a rollover. The other way to do it is just with a key fob, that somehow or another you put it out on a key fob, something like one of Ubicos or something like that, or put it on a QR code. In order to make this work, I think what we needed to define was a persistent user ID that could go into the document as well as the sub. And my suggestion is that this just allow it to be a URN or a URI. If you do that, then the DID could be a persistent URI. But then it could also be used by any other method besides DIDs. We, for example, when we were developing it, just put a GUID in there. The way we solved the problem of the little pieces that you get from all over the place is to have these little tokens that you can actually embed within the ID token. So we took the approach that you would create a token that would carry additional information. Then you would turn that into a Jose 3-part token and just stick it in as one of the elements within the ID token. Then looking at the ID token itself, it probably is something created by, in a self-issued case, it's probably created by a user agent that would carry that same information that the ID token tends to carry today, plus these other fields. The flows are just the flows that Tobias was already talking about. Besides implicit flow, which is everything goes up in the ID token, we'd try to find this device flow where the laptop or something would be your primary device, and then the phone would just be the authenticator. The formats, I don't really much care about the formats. It would be nice to do CBOR. These things get kind of large, so being able to reduce it to 1/3 of the other size would certainly be a good idea. Anyway, those are the kinds of approaches that we took. Maybe the most controversial is this idea of just sticking them in as Jose elements inside the existing ID token. They're the inverse of what Tony was talking about. Any questions about it? Or
how would you link the persistent identifier to the keys.
Those would be the methods that we talk. I just call them recovery methods. So the recovery methods would be a method that you'd have to go through, which would do the binding on those. And the nice part about doing it in that with that kind of an approach is that you could, first of all, you can have more than one key active at a time during the rollover period. So if you have a connection going on with the process, and then there's some sort of key rollover, or I guess recovery, that wouldn't destroy what those other things are. But the next time that you'd hook up, you'd have to go through a process of linking the new key in, and that would that would be a protocol in itself, just another protocol to go through and do that process. And that would leave the persistent ID as the ID that you're known by on the websites. Does that make sense?
And how would you establish the initial binding so that I would know that identifier PDQ is reliably associated?
Right. So the process there, that was in the presentation that I gave last time. I don't actually have that presentation open right now, but there's a Bootstrap process that you'd have to go through. And during the Bootstrap process, you'd have to have some kind of a manual thing that you'd get from some site that you were recognized at. We were thinking of perhaps a QR code, for example. So you would, if you were at a IAL2 level of assurance, you'd have to have some IAL2 process that you go through. You'd get some QR code that would come back from that. Then you go through another process with the phone, where you took the phone and we'd have something like, for example, a software token a software statement on that. During that process, you would bind the phone to this same identity. Then the next time, and there's a third step with federation, but in any case, that ID token would carry those little pieces, those little, I call them niblets, which are the ID token piece and the authentication token piece within the ID token. We actually have some code running to show how that would work in the medical profession case. So we've tried to make it very simple. So if I go through the manual process, you go to some site like a doctor's office where you get a QR code, or you could get it from their website. You take that plus the phone, and when you get the phone, you have to download an app. After you download the app, you go through what I call a credential service provider in order to get an instance binding of that app to your phone. Then whenever you send out an ID token, you would get these two little mini tokens embedded in the ID token, which showed that you were IAL2 for the identity proofing and showed that you were AAL2 for the fact that the phone was trusted to do authentication.